I'm a faculty member in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And I would like to introduce our host for this afternoon, Michael Gatan. He's going to present all of our speakers. He is a wonderful undergraduate with us at NYU and has been really helpful in organizing our session today. And I'm going to come back on with everyone at the end of our discussion. And just to make clear the format, we're holding it first as a Zoom webinar so that we can all focus on our speakers. And after they've presented and we've had some discussion, then we're going to open it up as a Zoom webinar and stop recording. So this part of the session will be recorded for everyone to be able to watch again afterwards. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Michael, who will be introducing our event today.
Good afternoon. As Jordana mentioned, my name is Michael Gatan and I'm a student at New York University. On behalf of the KJCC, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at NYU, and the Institut Ramon Llull, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar on Catalan novel in translation. The first part of the webinar will feature a roundtable discussion among our panelists. Following that, we will shift the format to a seminar in which all attendees who have questions will have the opportunity to post their questions in the chat or unmute themselves and ask their question. The first part of the webinar, as Jordana also mentioned, will be recorded and later uploaded to the KJCC YouTube channel and website with captions. Our panelists today are Ann Newman, Peter Bush, Chad W. Post, and Helena Buffery. Each will offer their perspective on the Catalan novel as translators, as scholars, and as publishers, respectively. In the chat is a link to their bio. Webinar participants may put their questions in the Q&A box. Now for our first speaker, Ann Newman. Ann is a translator, independent scholar, and cultural administrator who helped bring Catalan culture to the US public. She has translated Rubert de Ventós, Monzó, Carner, and Sagarra. She received the Creu de Sant Jordi in 1998 and is currently President-delegate of the Premi Internacional Catalunya. She is the 2020-2021 Scholar in Residence at the KJCC at NYU. Ann.
Thank you, Michael. I'm very grateful to be here with you today, wherever here is, here on this screen with so many dear friends and colleagues. Peter, starting with Peter, Helena, and Chad. Thank you to Professor and Director and dear friend Jordana Mendelson for organizing this panel and for my appointment as Scholar in Residence. To come back to the King Juan Carlos Center at NYU in this capacity is to relive practically my whole adult life. In 1973, I was an administrative assistant at the NYU International Student Center, which was located on the ground floor of 53 Washington Square South. That is, the very building in which the KJC Center is located. But it's a bittersweet thing to be there only metaphorically when even the building itself is part of my history is one of the milder cruelties of the pandemic. And not to be with you is one of equally cruel. I admit to having a bit of imposter syndrome, to be speaking as a scholar when my publications are scarce, even to be speaking as a translator with only 5 important published works, a book of short stories and a novel by Quim Monzó, an essay on Spanish America by Rubert de Ventós, a book of rhyming poems, Bestiary by Josep Carner, one of the great Catalan poets, and the classic novel Private Life by Josep Maria de Sagarra. But I'm not asking Jordana to take back the appointment. I would simply like to address here the many ways in which a certain translator's ethic and métier, the word comes from ministerium, from service, can infuse one's life and work, and the way scholarship informs every aspect of the work of a cultural administrator and translator. I am also a little bit old, at that stage when every story begins 20 to 40 years ago. Please bear with me. In 1970 or 71, just a couple of years before I worked in that building, I discovered my vocation. I was reading Pablo Neruda's 20 poemas de amor y una canción desesperada, 20 love poems and a desperate song, or a song of desperation, as one will do at 18 or 19. That was the first time I understood a poem spontaneously and felt the unmediated thrill of understanding. To add to the cliche, it was poem 20, the famous one that begins, "Puedo escribir los versos más tristes esta noche." I can write the saddest verses tonight. I was feeling all the feelings. In fact, I was so overwhelmed with emotion that the first thing I thought to do was to translate it. I wanted my mother and my aunt to hear this beautiful thing. The important thing, though, is that I was hooked. Translation was an impulse. Even more Freudian, it was a drive, an excitatory state produced by a homeostatic disturbance. From then on, I could not translate. On reading a work to which I had access, and my mother didn't, I was compelled to share it with her. And this is one of the things that I believe moves the translator. The thing about translation is that it always entails a choice, a decision. The very first choice is whether to keep the treasure to yourself or share it with others. Then comes the infinitude of choices which so much of translation theory addresses: fidelity versus loyalty, estrangement versus, beauty, loyalty to the text, the author, how much to smooth the edges, how many flaws to leave, where you situate yourself between the source text and the target text, between the author and the reader. Who is the reader? How much does she need me? A minefield of decisions, all with an ethical content. I went on to study literature, Spanish American, then Spanish Peninsular, then independently Catalan. Translation was basically a skill I used for my papers, which is very good training. But here too, there was an ethical aspect. For me, the politically engaged American Spanish afforded a vantage point from which to observe the states from a critical distance, from Latin America, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Chile, where society was being transformed. And then I went to Spain with NYU in 1972, still under Franco. It was then at 20 that I discovered Barcelona, and it was love at first sight. Catalonia was no less subject to Franco, but it too offered a vantage point on the dictatorship, certainly a more active resistance than the circles I was able to frequent in Madrid, if only by virtue of the presence of that other beautiful and mysterious language. In 1975, Franco died, and in 76, I had to return. I felt compelled to return to see Spain without the dictator. Once more, I attended NYU in Spain, where I did my MA degree, and NYU is a leitmotif. In 1977, I had another choice: go home or try to find a way to make a living in Barcelona, which I did. And I spent mornings working and afternoons roaming the streets and listening, picking up the music of the language, reading Mercè Rodoreda, Biel Mesquida, and Salvador Espriu. I'm going to fast forward. Suffice it to say that Catalan was my fascination. I was fortunate on my return to New York to meet David Rosenthal, who was translating Mercè Rodoreda and all the poets, and ultimately Tirant lo Blanc, the great Valencian chivalresque novel. Still a wonderful version, by the way. David was single-handedly and heroically bringing Catalan literature to the English-speaking audience. You might say he was the Peter Bush of the 70s and 80s. Happily for Peter, a good crew of new translators has emerged, or I would fear for his health. In 1980-81, I was back in Barcelona, now with a Fulbright scholarship, when the translation dysphoria overtook me again. I was reading deeply in fin de siècle literature for my dissertation, Eugène Dors and everything that emanated from him, going back to the modernistas to understand his anxiety of influence, and reading his contemporaries to understand his influence. And reading him and his incredible groundbreaking prose. For fun, I would read wonderful contemporary writers hot off the presses: Elena Valentí, Carme Riera, Montserrat Roig, wonderful writers. And then thunder struck. Olivetti, Molinex, Chafoteau, and Maury had just been published, and I discovered Monzó. I had to translate him. Here, a new kind of choice comes into play, because of course the Fulbright, and this is once again going back to how the translating ethic informs the choices one makes that have really configured my life. Because of course the Fulbright also has an ethics and its own servitudes. The Fulbright is not only a scholarship, it is also an opportunity, in a way, an obligation to engage in public diplomacy, to be a good cultural emissary for the United States. So sometimes one does not make one's own choices. Sometimes they are made for one. The cultural attaché invited all the Fulbrights to lunch at a lovely restaurant. And the following day, he called me and said, "Marianne, I would like to support the Spain of the autonomies. And I think a good way to do that would be to establish exchange programs. Would you like to help me? And indeed I would. When I went home for Christmas, I learned that the great, by a stroke of good luck, John Bradamus had just been named president of NYU. He had done his dissertation in the 1950s on anarchism in Catalonia and Andalusia. It's hard to imagine a more perfect constellation of events. A university president with knowledge of Catalonia. Things were looking good. I went back to Barcelona and talked with Xavier Rubert de Ventós, one of the people I translate, and one of my mentors, readers, and friends. And we were excited at the prospect. Did I mention that it was 1980-81? 3 days and 20 years ago, today was 23F, the 23rd of February, in which the civil guard, Antonio Tejero, took over the Congress and tried to overthrow the Spanish government. I let the dust settle for a month or so and called the cultural officer, expecting to pick things up where we had left them, but no. This formerly enthusiastic gentleman said to me, "Oh no, Marianne, our focus is no longer on the Spain of the autonomies. Now we must concentrate on supporting Spanish democracy." So I went back to Xavier and he said to me, "Don't worry, I'll speak to Pascual." Pascual was at that point the first deputy mayor to Narcís Serra. And Narcís Serra ended up going to Madrid to be the head of the Ministry of Defense, and Pascual became the mayor. And so the Catalan Studies program at NYU was born under the umbrella of Barcelona, and it was an exchange program with the University of Barcelona. Ultimately, we ran over. It was a direct line to Jordana because as the Catalan teacher in that program, I taught Robert Lubar, who was her mentor. And the Catalan Studies program, sadly, only lasted from 83 to 86. And I went on to teach at Williams, Bard, and Middlebury College. During those 3 years, though, every waking hour was devoted to bringing Catalan culture to New York, a different kind of translation. Now, not only translating myself, but establishing a platform for others to perform their translatios. Still, Monzó was simmering in the back of my mind. That was when I got a very skewed understanding of how publishing of translations worked. The director of the Catalan Studies program, Professor John Coleman, knew a literary agent, Thomas Colchi, who knew a publisher, Michael White. I sent Tom a dossier, a bio from Monzó, and a translation of 3 stories from Olivetti, Molinax, Sheffield, and Marie. He loved them. He took on the project. Wait a second, I am going to share the screen because I want to show you the cover. Where is the PowerPoint? Oh gosh, we've practiced this and now it's not coming up. Is this it?
Marianne, do you want me to share it for you?
Yes, please.
Okay. Give me 1 second.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, the agent loved them. He took on the project. Are you sharing it, Alexandra? Okay. He took on the project. He contacted his friend Robert White, and they decided to publish them with available press and imprint at Ballantine Books. It was called Available Press. Thank you. Let's go down. Let's skip the poem and go to, yes, Carner. Nope. Oh, good. The 2 poems are there. All right. Next slide, please. Oh. Okay, well, something happened. It doesn't matter. I do have to go back to the paper though. It was published by Available Press. It was called Available Press because their mission was to publish groundbreaking work inexpensively. They used the cheaper available time on the printing presses to do short runs between longer printing runs that require advance notice. It was so easy. I even got an exemplary contract with a 2% royalties clause, which is the good thing about having an agent who is a translator. But then an interesting thing happened. Monzó was then in New York writing a novel, Benzina. Publishers notoriously prefer novels to short stories, so the text they acquired was the novel. I translated it, and then they decided they preferred the short stories, which I translated for the same price. The important thing was to get Monzó in print. Here's the amazing cover of the English translation of Olivetti, with the incredible blurb that pairs Monzó. I hope you can see it. It says, Catalan culture is one of the world's richest. It has given us the art of Dalí, Cavalier, Miró, Gaudí, and Casals. Now it gives us Monzó and his astonishing fabulism. And on the back cover, it actually tells you how to pronounce his name also phonetically. They were very attentive to the whole Catalan question. In truth, with the incredible blurb that pairs Monzó with all the best known representatives of Catalan culture for an American audience. In truth, by presenting Monzó as a Catalan author, they were Catalanizing the great Catalans. At the time, more than one person came up to me and said, you know, I didn't know Dalí was Catalan. So the universal Catalans at that point, 1986, were still known as Spanish artists. Franco had only been dead for 10 years. You may be wondering how the title went from Olivetti Molinac's Chafoto y Marie to O'Clock. We may have time later to talk about this, but I want to tell you that the book, even what are the vagaries of how books are presented. It even got a boxed short review in the New York Times Book Review. But here is one of the sadnesses of promoting Catalan literature at the time. The Times assigned the review to a reviewer of Spanish literature who had no context for this utterly urban, modern, sexy, and unpredictable Catalan writer, the singer of Barcelona. The review seized on the fantastic nature of some of the stories to establish to the book as surrealist and to compare him with Federico Garcia Lorca. Needless to say, this, I don't think, contributed to the understanding of the book or the author. Still, it was all very promising. Monzó continued to write, and I continued to translate him. When El Perquè de Tot Plegat, The Why of It All, literally, came out, which is my absolute favorite book of Monzó's, though I love them all, I translated 13 stories, they're very short, and began to shop them around. I was never successful. The rejection I remember with most resentment was a note from the Paris Review. The Perquè de Tot Plegat is a very stripped down and baleful look at sexual mores in which women and men come in for equal opportunity opprobrium. The editor of the Paris Review lamented that the characters had no psychological depth. Clearly, it was not a good fit for the Paris Review, or indeed in general. I think American publishers are afraid to publish characters who aren't likable. We can perhaps talk about that. But in any case, Monzó was not concerned with making his characters likable, but they're compelling. Only a few years ago, finally, thank God, Chad Post published Peter's translation, Why? And I'd love to hear what kind of reviews it's got too. In the meantime, Xavier Rubert de Ventós had published The Hispanic Labyrinth, Tradition and Modernity in the Colonization of the Americas, an award-winning vindication and fact of the Americans and the Jesuits. I had the immense pleasure and privilege of living inside the head of a philosopher as I translated it. And this is one of the great translation pleasures we rarely discuss, the osmotic process by which the author's language inhabits your head. Of course, you have to like or love the book or the author, otherwise it must be torture, but I fortunately have not had that experience. In light of my failures as a promoter of translators, I went on to practice more institutional translatio and worked with Pascual Maragall, also at the King Juan Carlos Center in 1998 when he was Distinguished Visiting Fellow. As a result, he invited me to work at the Forum of Cultures in Barcelona, which I did in 2002, and then Maragall became president. He invited me to work in his Office of Foreign Affairs, but I had my sights set on the Institut Ramon Llull, on bringing Catalan literature to the world. What I discovered though was that in Catalonia, I was just one more person doing that job and probably less well than the Catalans. My exchange value was only of value in the US. And this led me back to NYU, where we established the Catalan Center at New York University. And it was then that I met Chad Post, who was thinking of acquiring Benzina, Kim's novel of 1986. It was utter serendipity that I found out about it. Of course, Kim, true to his perfectionism, had rewritten the whole novel, changing all the verb tenses from simple past to present continuous. But of course he was right, obsessively right. And I was very grateful to Chad for allowing me to have that commission, because I had no right to it. The Catalan Studies program also came to an abrupt end in 2011. Is it time? Is it time, Alejandra?
Yeah.
Am I over my time?
No, but you can wrap up.
Okay. All right. I wanted to show you also the choices that a publisher may have to make. So those are the next two slides. They are the original cover of Private Life. I was lucky to get I went to speak with the publisher of Private Life. I was the son of the author of Private Life. I went to speak with Juan de Sagarra 10 years in 2004. And because I adored this novel and I wanted to translate it. And Sagarra said, no, I don't know why. He said, oh, why would you want to translate that? And so I gave up. And fortunately, when the Institut Ramon Llull intervened and Archipelago Press decided to publish it, Jadranka, unbeknownst to her, she didn't really know that I adored the novel, but some angel was looking over her shoulder and she suggested me as a translator. So here's another question of a choice, and this has a certain ethical quality to it too. Jill Schoolman had chosen this cover, which is a drawing by Matisse, and it is a wonderful, wonderful evocation of the demi-monde that the novel begins with. I'm going to read you one quote from the book, because it's the moment when Frédéric, who wakes up in a floozy's apartment, who had been his lover as a young man, and he's now a married man and has just taken up with this woman again. And it says, Frédéric's speech had the effect of a musical interlude. Rosa played her grand role with an eye to Frédéric's emotional range to marvelous effect. With a dancer's grace, the abandoned Niobe lifted the solemn folds of her tunic, and Frédéric found Rosa Trenor's calf warm beneath her chiffon stocking in his hands. And then I'm going to skip down. Frédéric, so that you can see why Jill chose this cover. Frédéric felt that the words were of no use, and while still respecting the border that separates man from gorilla, he attempted to achieve a definitive outcome on top of that silk divan, the color of a turtle dove's breast. But modestly, yet still strongly insinuating, Rosa objected. No, Frédéric, not here. So you can see the divan here, the divan, and the silk dress, the silk. She's basically wearing a slip, the silk slip, and the divan. It's a perfect cover, and it actually represents more of a 1920s, I think, aesthetic. And Alexandra, the next slide. The final cover came about because I went to speak with Alex Susana, who was the director of the Institut Ramon Llull, and we were talking about the problems of the translation. And he said, oh, but you have to, the cover, I have the perfect cover, you have to use this. And he showed us this beautiful, beautiful painting by Ramon Casas. Now, there is a question as to whether which of these covers is indeed more appropriate, because the book takes place in 1929 and 1932, but there are flashbacks to the period at the turn of the century, which is what this painting by Casas reflects. But Jill decided to use The Decadent Young Lady, which is the Casas work, because of her respect for Catalan culture. So I think there are always ethics involved in these choices, and I'm going to leave it here, even though I'm I hope we can talk about other translations and perhaps read that little Carner poem at some point afterwards. But I'm looking forward to hearing Peter talk as well. And thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Our next speaker is Peter Bush. Peter is a literary translator and previous director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. His most recent translation is Josep Pla's Saltwater. He has just finished translating Victor Català's film 3,000 Meters and is now working on Rosa Maria Arquimbau's 40 Lost Years and Najat Al-Hashmi's Mother of Milk and Honey. Peter, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Can you hear me? Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I first went to Barcelona in 1969, and I went there in a political capacity. I was involved in a socialist group, and I went there to give a series of lectures on Marxism and how to set up a political party. And we met in a secret hideout, and I gave these lectures. And then I was working for this party, and they had a newspaper, and I had languages, so I became the person who wrote all the articles that were based on Spanish news bulletins from Spain, Latin America, and so on. And my first translations were actually of political tracts and the descriptions of what was going on in Latin America and Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And my first poem that I translated was Octavio Paz's translation on the massacre of 1968 in Mexico City. But then, kind of fast forward really to 2003, when I resigned from being director of the British Centre of Literary Translation, where I've been working for 5 years, kind of promoting literary translation throughout the UK and internationally, to move to Barcelona, where I lived for 10 years with my partner Teresa Solana. And I won't go into all the ins and outs of my relationship with Catalan, but basically I then became immersed in Catalan and to speak it really for the first time, although my Catalan goes back also to the 1960s. Anyway, unbeknown to me, Peter Owen, a publisher in the UK, was interested in translating Kim Monzó's novel, La magnitude de la tragédia, the enormity of the tragedy. And in 2006, I got this email from an editor at Peter Owen saying, would you be interested in translating it? And I thought, well, yeah, I would be interested in translating it, but can I really translate it? I didn't study Catalan at university, although by that stage I translated over 50 books from French and Spanish and Portuguese and so on. But I read the book, I really loved it, and so I said yes. And also my partner Teresa was a translator and a Catalan speaker, and so she agreed. She kind of looked through my translation to make sure that I hadn't made any kind of terrible errors. So the book came out in 2007, which I think was a watershed in the translation of Catalan literature, because Catalonia was the invited country at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and that meant that all publishers throughout the world suddenly became focused on Catalonia and Catalan literature and interested in translating Catalan literature. And they were helped by the Institut Ramon Llull, who had made it as a priority that they were going to translate more prose fiction by classical authors and by living authors. And kind of since then, I've translated over 20 works from Catalan, 8 books of short stories and 10 novels. And I want to talk a bit about some of the issues. I think Catalan culture has been fractured as Spanish culture is fractured by the Civil War. And that fracturing of culture has had a severe impact on Catalan literature and its translation. It also meant that within Catalonia and within Spain, literature tended to be seen politically. You know, what side was the author on, not whether was the work any good that he'd written. So, for instance, Josep Pla, who kind of seemed sided for a while with Franco, was kind of looked down upon by lots of authors. And Víctor Catalan, who had also been against the Reds, as it were, was also frowned upon. And even Joan Salas was frowned upon because he was Republican, but he was Catholic. So there are all kinds of issues that came up that made it difficult for certain books to be read by certain people, and to be used in universities and schools after Franco died. And I think that there's an important role of the Institut Ramon Llull, but also of small publishers in Catalonia, or big publishers, who, like Maria Boigas at Club Editor, who decided to republish In Certa Gloria, the novel by Joan Salas, a major novel of the Civil War, and also Víctor Catalan's Un film 3,000 metres, and 3 volumes of her short stories. So I think that what I do now is talk about the 3 works that I'm kind of currently involved in, and say something about how that's going, really. First of all, the translation of Un film 3,000 metres, which I just a few weeks ago sent to Chad Post. You know, how did this come to be? How did I come to be asked to translate it? Well, I think that Chad and Kaija Stramanis, that the open letter, were invited by the Llull to go to Barcelona with a group of publishers from all around the world to be introduced to agents, hear talks about Catalan literature and so on. And they heard writer and literary editor, journalist Jordi Nopka talk about Víctor Catalan's novel, and they immediately thought, this is a novel for open letter. It's our kind of book. And then a few months later, I went to the London Book Fair, met up with Kaija, and she asked me whether I'd be interested in translating it. Then the Rosa Maria Arquimbau book, 40 Lost Years, 40 anys perduts. Rosa Maria Arquimbau was a novelist I had never heard of. But I met the feminist scholar and poet Maria Ángeles Cabré in the summer on the beach in Calella de Palafrugell, and we were talking about, you know, kind of what should be, you know, what would be good to get out there in English. And she kind of gave me a number of titles and authors, and one of them was the Rosa Maria Arquimbau book. And around the same time, the critic of the Vanguardia, Julià Guillamón, had been doing his own promotion of Rosa Maria Arquimbau with a publisher, again, a small publisher who was promoting work by Catalan authors who'd kind of like disappeared. And so that novel was published along with, and also Coma Negra published 2 books of the short stories. I read it and kind of really loved the book, so I took the idea of a translation to Fum d'Estampa, a new publishing house set up by Douglas Suttle to publish specifically literature from Catalan, and he agreed after he read the novel and enjoyed it. And then the third novel I would like to mention is the one Mother of Milk and Honey by Najat Al-Hashmi. Now, I'd already translated Najat's first novel. To say something about Víctor Catalan. Víctor Catalan was born in 1869 and died in 1966. And this novel by her was written in 1918-21. It was published in a journal as a kind of serial fiction. The Rosa Maria Arquimbau's book was published in 1971 under Franco, but she'd actually started writing it in the 1940s. And she was a woman who went into exile. She was a prominent feminist, fought for the right for women to vote, and organized support for Macià and the declaration of the Catalan Republic. So she was a very political activist, and she had to go into exile to France. She tried to go to Latin America. She got to North Africa, but unfortunately didn't manage to get onto a boat, so she didn't make it and had to go back to. She eventually went back to Spain. Najat's book, as I said, I translated The Last Patriarch. Now, unlike Víctor Catalan and Rosa Maria Arquimbau, whose novels were kind of shrouded and hidden by political developments and the Civil War, and Víctor Catalan's novel was attacked when it was published by critics who said, "What is this woman from L'Escala, this fishing village on the Costa Brava, who writes about country villages and country folk? You know, what does she think she's doing, writing a book that's essentially set in Barcelona and is about workers in factories? She doesn't know anything about them. She has no right to do that. She should stick to the kind of the rural scene." So they kind of did their best to bury the novel in the mid-1920s. Najat's first novel won the Ramon Llull National Prize for Literature. So and the book that I'm translating now is one that deals with a single mother who is making the trek with her small daughter from a village in the Rift Valley to Catalonia. All she has is the back of an envelope with an address on it, where her husband, who kind of departed several years before and kind of has not really been heard of since. And so she makes that journey, and the novel really tells that story. And I should say that Najat comes from a small village in the mountains in the Rift Valley. The novel, like Arquimbau's novel, is partly autobiographical. Najat's first language is Tamazight, a Berber language, and the novel is narrated partly by the mother, who obviously would have been speaking in Tamazight, but she's not, in the novel, she's not talking in Tamazight, she's talking in Catalan. But as Najat says, it is a Catalan that has behind it Tamazight. Some Tamazight words are used in the text. And it's an extremely moving and intense novel about migration and how this single mother who is illiterate makes that journey against all the odds with her child. She ends up working in a tannery in a Catalan town. So basically, these three authors, these three women authors, all have strong feminist perspectives, but they also have a strong sense of class. Their works are centered on the kind of the intersection between gender and class. And I think that as and an interest in creating a new kind of language. With Víctor Catalan, it's a language that is extraordinary. It goes from the Baroque, from Cubist, from kind of very ironic. It's a picaresque noir novel. The Arquimbau, Laura Vidal, the heroine, the narrator, is acerbic, anti-sentimental, very political, but then at the end, very disillusioned. And in Najat's novel, the end of the novel focuses on the tensions between the mother, the illiterate mother, and the daughter, who has grown up to be a Catalan young woman with different values. I'll end there. Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Chad Post. Chad is the director of Open Letter Books, a press at the University of Rochester that publishes contemporary literature from all around the world. Additionally, he is the managing editor of 3%, a blog and review site that promotes literature and translation and is home to the Translation Database and the Best Translated Book Award. His article and book reviews have been published in a range of publications such as the LA Times, Rolling Stone, the Wall Street Journal Culture blog, Vulture, and The Believer. Chad, please unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for everyone who's here. And thank you, Peter and Marianne, for your great talks just now and Helena's forthcoming one. There's a Catalan and Catalan culture. You mentioned being a pastor, Marianne. I speak no Catalan. I can barely speak Spanish to a degree. I'm very much of the monolingual set of things. So I'm truly the imposter here. But weirdly, Catalan literature has played a massive role in Open Letter and in my publishing career, more or less. And I think there's a few ways that this is going to end up tying together. But I'll start with the idea of, like, from the publisher's perspective, how we even got interested in Catalan culture. Because like you said, Marianne, there was very little. Like there was the one translator, that was doing most of the books, and there were a couple things that were out, like Rodoratus, Time of the Doves, the Monzó book that you translated. There are handfuls, but it wasn't very well known. And when I started in publishing, I started at Dalkey Archive Press, working for John O'Brien, who passed away recently. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But when I was there, we started as a press that was doing mostly American and British writers and reissuing translations that had gone out of print and doing a lot of like reprints of books and rediscoveries. And along the way, there had been a few different mentions by the NEA and by publishers, or not Publishers Weekly, but the NEA and then the Penn World Voices Festival, where they started looking into how many books were actually being translated. And this is where eventually the 3% problem, 3% blog came from. But they were talking a lot about trying to figure out, you know, what was happening, what weren't we seeing in America? And it was clear that like about 3% of all the books being published in America were translated, which seemed like astronomically bad and like a very low number. And if there's anything you know about publishing, we don't keep track of things very well. So these numbers are always like a little bit, fudgy on the edges. There's not a lot of detail. Don't ever ask a publisher what their sales are, because you'll never get the right answer. Like everything's like a little bit hazy, we'll say. So, but at the same time, John was very determined to like try and rectify this, and thought that it would be interesting to try and start finding authors from all the different parts of the world to bring them into English. And he had the idea, which proved true, that there are great writers everywhere that were just completely undiscovered that would be available to us if we went and looked for them, versus like competing with everyone for the same sort of American authors or British authors. There's like this whole world where you could go and find this like cornucopia of great writing and like find things. So we started a process of contacting all the different literary agencies, or like foreign agencies, book offices around the world, and visiting the different countries to meet with publishers, critics, authors, whomever we could, and whoever we could set up with. And in 2006, right before I ended up leaving Dalkey and starting Open Letter, we were invited to go to Iceland and then Barcelona. So I went on a trip by myself to Iceland, had one whole very interesting, beautiful experience, and then went, miles south to like this beautiful, brilliant, amazing, lively city in Barcelona. And when I was there, I really knew next to nothing about the literature, and was like truly like trying to soak up what was going on, figure out who's who, where everything is, what authors to pay attention to, all that kind of stuff. So the two authors that kept coming up over and over and over again were Quim Monzó and Mercè Rodoreda. And the way that everyone talked about them with like reverence and like, these are really important authors. They're like two ends, contemporary and more modernist, very, you know, different in various ways, but both are like crucial pieces of Catalan literary culture. I was like, these books have to be in print. And I came back to the States, left Delphi, came to the University of Rochester to start Open Letter. And the first year we were looking for what books we're going to put into our program. And there was one Rodoreda book in the library called A Broken Mirror that was published by the University of Nebraska Press. And so I grabbed that first, read it, and was just astounded. Like that book is so one of my favorite books, the way that it's constructed as going through three different kind of generations, but three different writing styles, moving from like a more naturalism through a modernist view to a very postmodern, more fragmented sort of writing. I was like, this is amazing. So got in touch and figured out that there were a number of her books especially from later in her life that had never been translated at all. So we published first Death in Spring, which is one of the very first books that Open Letter ever published and is to this date, the best-selling book that we have ever done. Nothing else has even come close. And so we started on this path of doing her and doing more of her books. We did her selected stories. We reprinted Camilla Street. We did War, So Much War. And then most recently, we published Garden by the Sea, which was like from her middle period. Most of the ones that we were doing were towards the end or the very beginning. And this one in the middle, Garden by the Sea, came out. And that came out right before the pandemic, right? So right when everything in publishing is just the best timing in the world to like have books come out. So the book comes out, it's a beautiful, beautiful book that's set in like the 20s, 30s, sort of hazy in that detail too. It's like this rich like, what I was gonna say, not resort, but rich gentrified area. There's a love story, it's beautiful. And when the pandemic hit, I was like, man, this sucks because this book is so good. It's the perfect summer book. It's a beach book. It could do so much for us. It's important, blah, blah, blah. And as it turned out, Books A Million, which is a chain of stores throughout the South. Like I think their headquarters is in Alabama. Books A Million has never carried an Open Letter book. Like in the history of Open Letter, they've never carried one title. We do not fit into like the rural South like setup that they have, and they're very typical chain. Whatever reason, they found out about Garden by the Sea, fell in love with it, and ordered 1,500 copies. So we had to reprint the book immediately after printing it. Then there's this box walla, this box, those box subscriptions where you get various books from around the world. They contacted us right after we sold that and had to order 1,000 copies. So we have 4 printings of Garden by the Sea in the past year, and it is now our 3rd best-selling book of all time at this moment. So it's like been a crazy set of success for her. And then with Monzó, we came about through the way that we talked about, we met coincidentally, we ended up doing Gasoline, then we did Guadalajara. And I want to tie in one story that you mentioned before I get into some more number stuff. When you mentioned that people weren't interested in like the characters being like unsavory or not very good. When we did the book that became titled 1,000 Morons, I met Kim in New York for the Penworld Voices Festival. And he's like, Chad, what are you doing? He's like, what, you want to publish this book? And I was like, why wouldn't I want to publish this book? He's like, these characters, they're so depressing. They're awful people. Like, why do you like this? And I was like, I think it's funny. And it has shown that like, Kim's books are like out of the books that we do that are funny, those are the ones that do the best for us, are his. He's really got a good audience. Very early on, he got a nice review in which they named him as like one of the great short story writers of this time period. And since then, every book that we bring out gets reviewed in the New York Times, gets like certain mentions, and has like a cult following behind it. So even YYY, with all of its like angry, crazy people, still was in the New York Times and got a very positive review. So that's been very good for us. And like you mentioned, Peter, so that was way back in 2006 when I went. Then in 2016 was when we went back, 2017, whatever, right around there, back for another trip that you mentioned with Jordi Nopka, who gave this presentation, this great overview of like Catalan writing. All the people that you've mentioned and that you've translated were mentioned in this presentation for all these publishers around the world. And he did bring up Victor Català as one. And it was like, ooh, eyes like lit up immediately. And then the other one that he put in there was this book, which is The Adventures and Misadventures of the Extraordinary and Admirable Joan Orpi, conquistador and founder of New Catalonia. And this is a wild, wild trip. This, for anyone who's interested in Catalan literature, Catalan in translation, Marifé Litham translated it. The book is written in a fake 1600s dialect that's inconsistent and not real, like it's not based on anything realistic. So she had to recreate that dialect into a fake 1600s English dialect that was inconsistent, all for the sake of humor. So the editing process was really interesting, in which I'd be reading and be like, okay, I don't understand like the spellings here. There's all different spellings or different word things, and be like, this part I'm losing, let's tune it down. And then there'd be parts where I'm like, this part could be even funnier. You need to like go hard. And so we kept modulating the nature of this like invented language throughout. And as I mentioned, like the 3% problem in the website that we run is based on the idea that only 3% of the books in America are in translation. As part of our like nonprofit and like altruistic impulses, a number of years ago, 2008, we started the translation database, where we would track every book that came out in America that was available for sale in America for the first time that it was translated, of fiction and poetry. So we didn't include like new translations of Dostoevsky or things like that that were circling. And if it was only available in Britain, we didn't count it until it was available in the US, just for sake of sanity. Because I did this all by myself late at night, looking through people's catalogs and like doing endless amounts of research. So now we have this though, and it was hosted at 3% for a while. We recently moved it over to Publishers Weekly. So if you go to Publishers Weekly and look at the translation database, you can search it for anything. You can look for how many books are from Ecuador since 2008. How many books are written by women were translated since in whatever given year. And for Catalan, like you mentioned, Peter, the first Frankfurt I went to was the one where they were guest of honor. And I still have a lot of the materials that I showed in my classes to like what the Ramon Llull and the put together to promote Catalan literature and to promote all of these authors. And they're gorgeous. They're just simply gorgeous materials. And the numbers do jump after that, clearly. But to date, what I have through 2020 is 54 works of fiction from 2008 through 2020 and 11 works of poetry. Which is not bad given the size of Catalonia and the size of like the publishing industry there. What's interesting about that is that we have done about 1/6 of those. So we are like one of the largest publishers of Catalan literature in America. Ironically, when John O'Brien passed away in December, the Press Delkey Archive was left to Deep Vellum in Texas, with my being in charge of like the editorial vision for Delkey going forwards and to keep everything going. Delkey published 5 books in a Catalan series some years ago. So now we have under control 15 of the 65 books that had come out during that period of time. So it's getting even bigger and bigger. The one thing that's worth noting in this too is that the ratio of male to female Catalan writers who have been translated is 2 to 1. So that's not unusual throughout the world of translation, unfortunately, but it's something that's worth noting. So we have gone on to do with Victor Català. We also signed on a book by Muriel Villanueva that's coming out the left-hand parentheses, and trying to do more female writers from Catalonia. The other thing, I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to say one other thing was that at the University of Rochester, I also teach a class, and I teach one on publishing, but then I teach another one on world literature and translation, with the goal of getting students that are interested either in becoming translators or just interested in the rest of the world. Like most of my students this semester are actually musicians who are studying like world music and want to incorporate literature into their degree. And there I found it's been very interesting to talk to students because they're not very familiar with international literature as a whole, because a lot of the classes now are so specific that they're reading like British literature, they're reading Irish literature, they're reading very closely. And if they aren't taking a foreign language, they're not really being exposed to anything. And I try and give them 10 books from all over the world at all points in time, with the idea of creating some sort of global citizenship and readership for things generally, instead of like categorizing it and focusing on everything, to try and get them interested in the books as a whole. And it's been really interesting to see the evolution over the past 10 years of the readership and the response to literature and translation. The publishing scene, you mentioned, Peter, that 2007 was like kind of a big year for Catalan literature. It's kind of a big year for publishing translations as a whole. That's like right where we start. And then there's all of a sudden there's like Transit, Restless, Deep Vellum, all these other presses that crop up, New Vessel, that are doing literature and translation. And it jumps and jumps greatly. Yeah, I'll answer your question in a second, Marianne.
Sorry. No, I wanted it for later.
Oh, okay, gotcha. But they've been the way that things have grown through the publishing world has had a huge impact on readership and on the people who are studying it. There's now like a very strong like translation Twitter groups, Instagram people that are posting about international literature, a lot of booksellers that are looking forward to new translations. And it seems to be growing in a very interesting way through that. And one of the things that I've always interested in terms of the countries and the books that we're publishing is frequently to find books from like smaller quote unquote languages or areas, because those writers rarely have the opportunity to be part of the global scene. Like in Catalonia is one thing, but like if you think of like Lithuania, they'll have access to like tons of books from European writers and from American writers, but none of their books are being read by any of these other writers. So they're only hearing like half the conversation. And so the way that we've tried to position ourselves as a publishing house is to try and start bridging those gaps, get people into, like, we can focus on Catalan literature in our Catalan literature series, but part of that is so that someone from Serbia can read this book in English and be able to know about this Catalan writer, know about Monzó or Rhoda, and have them influence their work, which then influences someone else, and just try to make this a big web of interconnected writing and a big dialogue, instead of it being just like compartmentalized or be only about money, since we are a nonprofit. So I'll leave it there, but I have lots more notes I wrote down, a lot of things I have to jump in or say, but I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Chad. Now for our next and final speaker, Helena Buffery. Helena is the lecturer at University Cork College, where she was previously head of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies, and is currently vice head of the CAC SSS. Her main teaching and research interests lie in contemporary Hispanic theater and performance, translation studies, and Catalan studies, but she has taught many other aspects of Hispanic literature and culture, and is particularly drawn to the diverse instances of intercultural contact that characterize the Hispanic world. Helena?
Hi, everyone. That's been utterly fascinating. I could have listened to the three of you for years. It's a real pleasure to be here alongside three figures I truly admire for the work they've done in bringing Catalan writing to wider audiences, and to get the chance with them to draw attention to the transformation in the translation landscape vis-a-vis Catalan in recent years, above all in the number of texts that are available in English, not only contemporary fiction, that will have made its way to the attention of publishers via book fairs and the brochures produced by Institut Ramon, but also classics, the texts that make a culture intelligible. And I think that relates to Ann Newman's question to Chad that we might come back to later. This is not to say that the translation activity that was happening before was negligible. It's important not to forget that there have been translations of modern Catalan literature since the 19th century, in particular poetry and also some theatre, which is what I generally do in my day job, is look at theatre. Furthermore, it would be a shame to overlook the pioneering work of people like Joan Gilly, Philip Polak's amazing translation of La Primera Historia de Esther in the 70s, E. Rochille's translation in the 1960s of La Casa del Diamant into Hiberno English, and of course the incredible work of David Rosenthal, who's already been recognised here earlier, who brought so many classic works, Vidal Blanc, Rodreda, Catalina Albert, into English. If nothing else, they remind us of the multiple routes by which culture is transmitted across linguistic and geographical boundaries. The role of academics linked to the Anglo-Catalan Society and the NACS, not only in translating themselves, as in the case of Ann Newman, Josep Maria Sobrer, who's also been mentioned, but also Kathleen McNerney, but also in providing a context for reading these works, a context that had pretty much been erased in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War. And that's something that Peter's acknowledged in what he was saying earlier. Would we have the translation landscape we have today without this work? Would we have the list of women writers Peter Bush has mentioned without Kathleen McNerney, without Christine Arkinstall? If I return again and again to Kathleen, it is because she is someone who's remained quietly committed throughout her career to translating voices that were often silenced in their own space, were doubly or triply minoritized. She rightly received a prize for her short story collection of Catalina Albert's short stories, Silent Souls, the fruit of painstaking research in the Albert archive. in the same committed reading, listening, and contextualization of women's writing that I had the privilege to witness firsthand in co-translating Maria Mercè Marçal's novel with her, The Passion of Corn, into René Vivian. For those of us who teach aspects of Catalan culture outside Catalonia, the existence of translations in Spanish or in English has generally governed the way in which we structure our course materials and syllabus, as there have always been relatively few students at undergraduate level, or at postgraduate level indeed, who would have the level of Catalan necessary to read texts like Quanta Guerra, In Certa Gloria, Un Film. I still remember Peter being amazed that texts like El Quadern Gris or In Certa Gloria were not taught on syllabuses and were barely talked about in the UK. But how could we teach them, given the paucity until the end of the 1990s of translations from Peninsular Spanish, let alone Catalan? Benuti's oft-quoted 3% sounds generous vis-a-vis Spanish literature, although Latin American literature was, of course, more fortunate. And it is interesting that when Rodoreda was first marketed in that little journal we used to receive Catalan writing, it was via quotations from Gabriel García Márquez. Likewise, Tirant lo Blanc via Mario Vargas Llosa. I bet Vargas Llosa would be really happy to know that maybe the beginnings of a viable translation market for Catalan literature can be traced back to him. Such contingencies, the serendipity of cultural history and mobility, always appealed to me. I often think now how when I was a student, reading 100 Years of Solitude was de rigueur, and rightly so, it still should be read. But Gabriel García Márquez has pretty well been replaced by Roberto Bolaño. And what does that tell us? We could certainly reflect on the gender history here and the imbalances that Chad Post was talking about. Why were we reading Rodoreda via Rosenthal and not Villalonga via Deborah Bonner? Absolutely incredible translation, that one that was brought out in Dulce Archive again in 2010. Or The Towpath or Caldes. I have no problem admitting I had no idea about Villalonga's novel being in translation until it was republished by Dulce Archive. And it is brilliant, as I just said. Likewise, Ann Newman's translations of Kim Monzó, almost impossible to get hold of when I was a student, but would have potentially really transformed the way in which young students like me at that time encountered Catalan culture. The step change in translations really took place in the mid-2000s, I suppose. Numerous factors: grants for translation, the promotion of Catalan culture at fairs, but there are other key moments we could mention. Would we have the increase in numbers without the impact of something like Carlos Ruiz Zafón's The Shadow of the Wind, for instance, or the translations of Albert Sánchez Piñol? Martha Tennant's Death in Spring was something that for me really, I thought it was interesting Chad brought it up, but that really for me was the moment when sort of Catalan literature was really on the world stage again. The impact that it had, the decision of Virago to bring out a new translation of La Paz al Diamant, the role of Dulce Archive and Open Letter Books, and then the kind of the routes taken by crime fiction in translation. And I still remember the tours that Peter Bush was doing with Teresa Solana's novels, and how they really opened the eyes of many readers in the UK and Ireland to contemporary Catalan fiction. For me, as a reader and an academic, these translations have really made a difference to what I do. Partly because my prior focus on theatre in translation, which is where more translation was happening, has now really shifted towards narrative. That's also to do with contingencies. You have small children, you don't travel as much. You have a COVID pandemic, you don't travel as much, you don't get to see any theatre, and I'm really hoping we get to see some. But some of these translations have really transformed how I look at Catalan culture, and I think how we look at them more generally. For instance, the Rodoreda retranslations, previously approached by academics, as academics always used to approach translation really, in terms of what was lost, in terms of how they failed to properly stand in for the original text. Reading across those translations really helps you to understand the ways in which our understandings of that novel have changed over the decades. And I know Peter's talked about that. Peter's translation of Incerta Gloria made me see things that I hadn't noticed before in reading that novel and hadn't noticed in the criticism in reading that novel. In particular, the representation of the kind of rural Aragonese society in that novel. By him grappling with that, you know, the torture of having that voice in his head, I think it really brought to the fore some of the traumas involved in those limits, those fractures created by the Spanish Civil War. What I really value about translation, as I hope I've just shown a glimpse of here, is the way in which it makes me revisit my perspectives on Catalan culture and on Catalan's relationship to the world. It takes me back to where I started working on translation, looking at the history of Shakespeare in Catalan, the sense of something familiar made strange, of a decentering of culture, of a decentering of everything I held dear. When I began thinking about translations in the classroom, it was in order to understand misconceptions in student essays, and then to begin to use these alternative readings to think about the things that resist translation and how we can find ways to talk about them. Translation is one of the ways to talk about them, by translating yourself, by reading as a translator, and by reading other people's translations. From minority language, aren't all languages rendered minor by the hegemony of English? It is particularly necessary to be translated, but this is also potentially a traumatic process due to the way in which it draws attention to and enshrines existing cultural hierarchies and symmetries. Simona Scrabek, another person who I so respect in bringing Catalan culture to the world, talks about embracing this perspective of becoming minor, to see what we can learn from making the effort to look at the world multilingually as a minority language speaker, as readers in translation. I stuck to my 8-minute brief.
Thank you, Helena. Now, Jordana Mendelson will lead us in the Q&A session.